Chapter 8. Human Ontogeny and Phylogeny. If any intelligent evolutionist, who is familiar with the leading facts and arguments in support of the theory of organic evolution, were asked what is the strongest and most convincing array of facts and arguments in favor of that doctrine, he would most likely answer that it is the analogical argument from the ontogeny of the germinal cell to the phylogeny of the primordial germ. If he be familiar with the best literature on the subject, he will doubtless cite Professor Haeckel's great work on the evolution of man as the first, and in many respects the best, treatise in which that particular branch of the subject is exhaustively treated, and in such a manner as to make it popularly available. Its subtitle is A Popular Exposition of the Principal Points of Human Ontogeny and Phylogeny, I have already spoken of its high standing in the scientific world, and I have availed myself of many of the facts which he was the first to promulgate, and of which he was the first to recognize the scientific value. It is true that I have given an interpretation to the facts relating to the monera that is diametrically opposed to his, and I have invested them with a higher scientific value than he did. He was in search of the hypothetical connecting link between organic life and inorganic chemical compounds. In other words, he was in search of evidence to prove that life and mind originated from something that is the very opposite of both life and mind. He was, in fact, in pursuit of evidence to prove that there is no God. He found no such evidence. On the contrary, he brought to light a series of facts exactly adapted to the uses of his opponents. And I undertake to say that if the combined hosts of Christian believers could unite their wisdom, they could not imagine a series of facts better adapted than his to prove the existence of the God of Christian faith, and at the same time to prove that God rules this universe by means of immutable law. The world can never repay the debt of gratitude it owes to Professor Haeckel for the fearlessness and scientific integrity exhibited in promulgating a series of facts that, unless blinded by prejudice, he must have known were well demonstrative of the theory that he repudiated. He has given us the facts so minutely detailed and so amply verified that atheism can neither deny their existence nor their theistic significance. But that is not the only service Professor Haeckel has rendered to Christian theism. He has furnished arguments as well, and his arguments are backed by an invincible phalanx of facts. I refer particularly to his analogical argument from ontogeny to phylogeny. It is true that he employs it solely for the purpose of demonstrating the truth of the evolutionary hypothesis, but, as I shall undertake to show, it is as clearly demonstrative of theism as it is of evolution. In point of fact, it leaves nothing to be desired in the way of evidence for either evolution or theism. Before proceeding to the consideration of the argument from ontogeny, I desire to make a remark in reference to analogical arguments in general. In one of my former works I ventured to animadvert upon the practice, which has obtained for many years among certain polemics of high degree, which consists in the reckless employment of the analogical argument. This form of reasoning is abused probably more than any other, partly owing to its plausible character, and partly to a lack of power to discriminate between fanciful illustration and proof, between poetic license and scientific demonstration. One of the most common examples of the abuse of this form of argument is shown in reasoning from the metamorphosis of the caterpillar into the butterfly up to an immortal life for man. It is invalid, for the simple reason that the laws which govern the one are not identical with those which obtain in the other. The rule is that no analogical argument is valid from a scientific or inductive point of view unless it can be shown that the laws governing the phenomena observed are identical with those of the subject matter under investigation. I recall the attention of the logical reader to this rule for the purpose of reminding him that Professor Haeckel's analogical argument from ontogeny to phylogeny possesses the highest degree of validity, for the laws are obviously the same. There is, indeed, a causal relation between them, as will be seen later on. The general proposition is stated in the language of Professor Haeckel as follows: the history of the evolution of organisms consists of two closely connected parts, ontogeny, which is the history of the evolution of individual organisms, and phylogeny, which is the history of the evolution of organic tribes. Ontogeny is a brief and rapid recapitulation of phylogeny, dependent on the physiological functions of heredity, reproduction, and adaptation nutrition. The individual organism reproduces in the rapid and short course of its own evolution the most important of the changes in form through which its ancestors, according to the law of heredity and adaptation, have passed in the slow and long course of their paleontological evolution. Here, then, we have a clear and comprehensive statement of one of the greatest and most significant facts in nature. Ontogeny is the history of the development or evolution of individual organisms. Human ontogeny is the history of the development or evolution of the germinal cell of man from the moment of conception to maturity. Human phylogeny is the history of the evolution of the primordial germ from the monoran to man. Phylogeny is repeated in ontogeny. That is to say, the human embryo begins its history as a unicellular organism, microscopic in size, and possessing all the salient characteristics of the lowest unicellular organism known to science. In point of fact, there is a short period when the human embryo reverts to a formless, structureless condition. Of this our author remarks, at present, therefore, the majority of observers assume that between the original nucleated egg cell and the known nucleated parent cell there is a stage in which there is no real cell kernel or nucleus, and in which, therefore, the form value of the whole organic individual is no longer that of a true nucleated cell, but that of a non-nucleated cytode, i.e. a simple protoplasmic body in which no true cell kernel nucleus is to be found. Asterisk of the importance of this fact. Professor Haeckel has this to say: we regard it as a fact of the greatest interest that the human child, like that of every other animal, is, in this first stage of its individual existence, a non-nucleated ball of protoplasm, a true cytode, a homogeneous, structureless body, without different constituent parts. For in this monoran form, the structure of the animal, and thus of the human organism, is of the simplest conceivable nature. The simplest known organisms, and at the same time the simplest conceivable organisms, are the monera / most of which are minute, microscopic, and formless bodies, consisting of a homogeneous substance, of an albuminous or mucous soft mass, in which, though they are not composed of diverse organs, are yet endowed with all the vital qualities of an organism. They move, feed, and reproduce themselves by division. These monera are of great importance, owing to the fact that they afford the surest starting point for the theory of the origin of life on our earth. We shall presently have further occasion to point out their significance. Here we need only give due weight to the very remarkable fact that, both in germ history and tribal history, the animal organism begins its evolution as a structureless mucus ball. The human organism, like that of the higher animals, exists for a short time in this simplest conceivable form, and its individual evolution commences from this simplest form. The entire human child, with all its great future possibilities, is in this stage only a small, simple ball of primitive slime protoplasm. I have been thus particular in quoting somewhat at length what Professor Haeckel has to say in reference to the beginning of the ontogenetic history of the embryo of man for the reason that I regard it as possessing greater evidential value than any other stage of development. The particular reasons will more fully appear hereinafter. The later forms of the embryo corresponding to those of the phylogenetic series cannot be described in detail in a work like this, and the curious reader must be referred to the work from which I have quoted. It must be said, however, that the series of gradients is necessarily far from complete. The history of untold ages of years cannot be repeated in all its details within the space of 3/4 of a year. Nevertheless, the evidential value of what we have is not in the least impaired, for the salient features are reproduced with such circumstantiality of detail as to leave no room for rational doubt of the fact that human phylogeny is repeated in human ontogeny. Moreover, this being true, it follows that a causal relation exists between the two. That is to say, phylogeny is the cause of ontogeny, and this in turn is demonstrative of the never-failing potency and the far-reaching significance of the law of heredity. We have already seen that, at the beginning of the embryonic life of man, the beginning of organic life on the earth is faithfully and minutely repeated, and we know that the culmination of both histories is identical. That is to say, human phylogeny began with the monoran and culminated in man, and human ontogeny begins with the monoran and culminates in a completely formed human being. This of itself constitutes presumptive evidence of the truth of the hypothesis. If, therefore, such of the intermediate steps in the ontogenetic series as are shown to exist are even approximately the same as those in the phylogenetic series, the evidence is conclusive. More especially is this true if the intermediate steps do not transcend their regular order as they occur in the phylogenetic series. and other human ontogeny and phylogeny. 341 words. The value of the evidence is greatly enhanced by, if indeed it does not depend upon, the fact that the forms as they are developed in the ontogenetic series are never reversed in the order of their development in the phylogenetic series. Thus, the human embryo at a certain period has essentially the anatomical structure of the lancelet, later of a fish, and in subsequent stages those of amphibian and mammal forms. Moreover, in the further evolution of these mammal forms, those first appear which stand lowest in the series, namely, forms allied to the beaked animals, Ornithorhynchus, then those allied to pouched animals, Marsupialia, which are followed by forms most resembling apes, till at last the peculiar human form is produced as the final result. The point is that the order of development of these forms in the ontogenetic series is never reversed, and that, as far as they go, they correspond to the orderly sequence of their development in the phylogenetic series. This of itself is demonstrative of the causal relation between the two series and the dominating influence of the law of heredity in the process of organic evolution. It will thus be seen that the evidence in this case is analogous in character to that by which we determine the orderly sequence of geological strata. No one place has yet been discovered on our Earth where all the geological strata are present in the order in which they were deposited. Nevertheless, we know the order in which they were formed by comparison of the formations shown in different localities, and we know the order was never reversed, for the reason that we never find an older stratum above a later one. Thus, we never find the Cambrian overlying the Silurian, or the Devonian underlying either the Cambrian or the Silurian. The latter may be absent in a given locality, but it will never be found anywhere either above the Devonian or below the Cambrian. Hence, the geologist knows beyond the shadow of a doubt the orderly sequence of geological formations, and with these data he can reconstruct the past and predict the future. In like manner, the scientific evolutionist knows his ground. He knows, from a comparative analysis of phylogenetic and ontogenetic forms, that a causal relation must exist between the two. And that conviction becomes a certainty when he knows that the order in which those forms are developed in the two series is exactly the same. And he, too, is thus enabled to reconstruct the past and predict the future, for he recognizes in this law the one touch of nature that literally makes the whole world kin. He finds the key to his own pedigree in his own ontogeny, and he finds its details recorded, with unerring certainty and exactitude, in his own phylogeny. Step by step, he traces his ancestry back through myriads of forms and eons of time to the very beginning of organic life. And he recognizes his earliest earthly ancestor by its identity in form and substance with that which marked the first stage in his own embryonic life and development. From this induction, backed by innumerable facts, each pointing toward the one conclusion, he infers a law, the fundamental law of organic evolution, as Haeckel emphatically puts it, or more briefly, the first principle of biogeny. The following is Professor Haeckel's formal statement of the law, this fundamental law, on the recognition of which depends the thorough understanding of the history of evolution, is briefly expressed in the proposition that the history of the germ is an epitome of the history of the descent, or, in other words, that ontogeny is a recapitulation of phylogeny, or, somewhat more explicitly, that the series of forms through which the individual organism passes during its progress from the egg cell to its fully developed state is a brief, compressed reproduction of the long series of forms through which the animal ancestors of that organism, or the ancestral forms of its species, have passed from the earliest periods of so-called organic creation down to the present time. The causal nature of the relation which connects the history of the germ, embryology, or ontogeny, with that of the tribe, phylogeny, is dependent on the phenomena of heredity and adaptation. When these are properly understood, and their fundamental importance in determining the forms of organisms recognized, we may go a step further and say phylogenesis is the mechanical cause of ontogenesis. The evolution of the tribe, which is dependent on the laws of heredity and adaptation, affects all the events which take place in the course of the evolution of the germ or embryo. I have thus briefly set forth, mostly in the language of its ablest exponent, the most important fact in the history of organic evolution, as well as the strongest argument in support of the evolutionary hypothesis. It is but simple justice to Professor Haeckel to say that his facts are beyond dispute. Their development is the result of years of Herculean labor and conscientious research, and his love of truth for its own sake is demonstrated by the infinite pains he has taken to develop facts, even though they disprove his anti-theistic beliefs. His conclusions, so long as he keeps within the domain of organic evolution, are also eminently just and legitimate. That is to say, from the monoran to man, inclusive of both, no true scientist will gainsay either his facts or his conclusions. It is only when he attempts to go back of the monoran in search of efficient causes that he fails to see the true significance of the facts that he has brought to light. It is there that his ingenuousness ceases to be conspicuous, accepting in his confession that he has adopted a conclusion which is unsustained by any fact or phenomenon of nature. This, however, I have already pointed out. I now propose to inquire what further conclusions are legitimately derivable from the great law of interrelated and interdependent phylogeny and ontogeny. I am encouraged to do so because of the learned author's invitation to the philosophical world, to say nothing of the promised results. In the closing chapter of his great work, he makes this encouraging observation: the speculative philosopher who will take possession of the facts of ontogeny and explain them phylogenetically, according to that law, will introduce a greater advance in the history of philosophy than has been made by the greatest thinkers of all previous centuries. It must be admitted by the most apathetic that the prize is a glittering one and well worth striving for, but, unfortunately, I am barred out of the race by the professor's terms. In the first place, he qualifies the conditions by declaring, later on, that it cannot be doubted that these facts, if properly weighed and judged without prejudice, will lead to the professor's own atheistic conclusions. Besides, I am not a speculative philosopher, and the promised reward is limited to that class of thinkers. Moreover, the professor has exhibited to us, in his own proper person, a specimen of the kind of speculative philosopher that is required for his purposes. Judging from the sample and the task to be performed, it requires a philosopher who will adopt Professor Haeckel's facts as his premises and ignore them in his conclusions. In other words, there is no way of arriving at the professor's conclusions in relation to the origin of life on this planet except by completely ignoring his facts. This I cannot consent to do, even for the brilliant rewards naturally flowing from the introduction of a new element of confusion and uncertainty into the speculative philosophy of all previous centuries. I shall, nevertheless, take possession of the facts of ontogeny and explain them phylogenetically, as I understand them, with special reference to their bearing upon the question of the origin of life.